My name is Finn, and if there's one thing you should know about me, it's that I never expected to become the kind of person who people whisper about when I walk into a room. Not because I seek attention, far from it, but because my family made it their mission to convince everyone around them that I was a failure. It all started years ago, long before this graduation party. My parents were always quick to remind me that I wasn't as driven as my cousin Ezra. According to them, Ezra was destined for greatness, while I was destined to scrape by. It didn't matter what I did, good grades, steady work, or keeping out of trouble, it was never enough. Ezra was the golden example, and I was the lesson in what not to be. My Aunt Muriel, Ezra's mother, took every opportunity to make sure the family believed that narrative. She had this way of turning even casual conversations into subtle digs at me. If I mentioned a project at work, she'd smile tightly and say something like, "Well, at least you're keeping busy, even if it's not a real career." If I bought myself something nice, she'd laugh and say, "Must have been on clearance." It wasn't just words, either. The family gatherings always centered around Ezra's accomplishments. His piano recitals, his debate trophies, his internships. There was always a slideshow, a toast, or some story about how he had impressed someone important. Meanwhile, my achievements were brushed aside with a polite nod before the conversation shifted back to him. I tried not to let it bother me. For years, I told myself I didn't need their approval. But it's hard to stand in a room full of relatives who treat you like an afterthought and not feel the sting of it. The real breaking point came when I started my own business. It wasn't flashy, but I believed in it, and I poured every bit of myself into making it work. I kept it quiet at first, partly because I didn't want the inevitable comments, and partly because I wanted to succeed on my own terms. When word finally reached the family, Muriel laughed in my face. "Finn running a business?" she scoffed. "What could he possibly know about that? He probably won't last a year." My Uncle Robert just shook his head, muttering something about how I should have followed Ezra's example instead of playing around. I let them believe what they wanted. What they didn't know was that the business was growing faster than I ever imagined. I kept my progress to myself, quietly expanding, building connections, and slowly becoming someone who no longer needed their approval or their money. Which brings me to Ezra's graduation party. The entire extended family was there, along with Ezra's teachers, friends, and some local figures my aunt and uncle had invited to make the event feel more prestigious. The house was decorated top to bottom, with a massive banner stretched across the yard. "Congratulations, Ezra." When I arrived, dressed neatly but not extravagantly, I could feel the stares. People noticed me, sure, but not in a kind way. It was the kind of look that says, "What's he doing here?" My Aunt Muriel's voice cut through the hum of chatter almost immediately. "She can't possibly afford this," she muttered loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear, though she meant me. The chuckles that followed were like little knives in my back. My uncle rolled his eyes, as though my very presence was some kind of inconvenience. Ezra smirked, clearly enjoying the show. I tried to brush it off and headed inside. That's when one of Ezra's teachers approached, holding a folder. At first, I thought he was bringing something for Ezra, but when his eyes landed on me, he froze. He blinked rapidly, his expression shifting from polite confusion to outright shock. "Wait," he said slowly, looking from me to the folder and back again. "You're in charge." The room, which had been buzzing with conversation only moments before, went silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward me, waiting for an explanation. And in that moment, I realized the perfect storm I had been waiting for had finally arrived. I froze, not because I was caught off guard by the teacher's words, but because of the sheer weight of the silence that followed. The music in the background seemed suddenly too loud, the clinking of a fork against a plate too sharp. Everyone had stopped mid-conversation, mid-breath, mid-thought, waiting. The teacher, Mr. Callahan, if I remembered correctly, still held the folder, his hand hovering slightly as though he wasn't sure whether to give it to me or pull it back. His brow furrowed in confusion, and he gave me a second look, like he was trying to reconcile the image of me with whatever name or signature he had seen inside that folder. "You're Finn, right?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I answered, steadying my voice, though I could feel the weight of dozens of stares pressing against me. Behind him, I saw Muriel's lips curl into that familiar sneer. She was already preparing to pounce, and I could practically feel the venom bubbling on her tongue. "Excuse me," she said loudly, taking a step forward, her heels clicking against the floor. There must be some mistake. That folder is for Ezra. He's the graduate here, not. She waved her hand dismissively in my direction. Not him. Several guests chuckled nervously, as though this was just another one of Muriel's jokes. Robert, my uncle, crossed his arms and shook his head, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Ezra leaned against the wall with his signature smug grin, already certain that whatever misunderstanding this was would resolve in his favor. But Mr. Callahan didn't laugh. He glanced back at Muriel, then at me, and his confusion only deepened. No, this is definitely for Finn, he said, flipping the folder open briefly to double-check. His name is right here. And, well, frankly, I'm a little surprised myself. That last part hung in the air, tantalizing. I could see the curiosity lighting up in the eyes of the guests. What could possibly be inside that folder? What did it have to do with me? Muriel didn't let him continue. She stepped closer, her voice tightening like a rope around my neck. Mr. Callahan, you've been misinformed. Finn doesn't handle anything of importance. He barely manages his own life. I assure you, whatever is in there has nothing to do with him. Her words stung, not because I hadn't heard worse before, but because she said them so confidently, so assured that everyone would agree with her. And for years, they had. I felt the heat rising in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm. This wasn't the moment to lash out or try to defend myself with empty words. I knew something Muriel didn't, and that knowledge was my anchor. Ezra finally decided to chime in, his voice dripping with condescension. Yeah, Mr. Callahan, I think you've got the wrong guy. Finn doesn't really do much. Unless you count wasting time as an occupation. A ripple of laughter followed, but this time it was thinner, more uncertain. Some guests were starting to pick up on the tension, realizing that something was off. Mr. Callahan, to his credit, didn't back down. He held the folder closer to his chest and looked directly at me. Finn, maybe you should explain. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been keeping something from everyone. The silence deepened again, heavier than before. My heart pounded in my ears, and I could feel every gaze fixed on me like a spotlight. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could get a word out, Muriel interrupted yet again. She laughed, sharp and humorless. Oh, please. Explain what? That he's been freeloading off others? That he's trying to pretend he's someone important? Let's not waste these people's time. This was her game. Cut me down before I had the chance to stand. It had worked on me for years, silencing me, making me small. But tonight, I wasn't the same Finn she thought she knew. I straightened my shoulders, letting the weight of the moment ground me. Actually, I said slowly, my voice carrying through the hushed room. Maybe it's time I do explain. Ezra snorted. This should be good. But I ignored him and focused on Mr. Callahan. Go ahead, I told him softly. You can say it. He hesitated, clearly unsure whether he was stepping into the middle of some long-running family feud, but eventually, he nodded. He opened the folder again, flipping through a few pages before speaking carefully. This folder contains the details of the sponsorship and funding behind several of our academic programs. He began. And from what I see here, Finn, you're listed as one of the primary contributors. Actually, more than that. You're the lead sponsor. The room erupted in whispers. What? Impossible. Did he say sponsor? Muriel barked out a laugh that didn't match the unease in her eyes. That's absurd. Finn doesn't have that kind of money. He can't even afford. She cut herself off quickly, realizing she was about to expose just how little she thought of me. Robert stepped forward, his voice low and skeptical. Are you saying this kid is paying for the school's programs? That can't be right. Mr. Callahan adjusted his glasses, looking uncomfortable but resolute. I didn't believe it either, but the documents don't lie. Finn's company is listed here, along with his personal authorization. I even met his representative a few months ago when we finalized the agreement. All eyes turned back to me. Ezra's smirk faltered, replaced by something sharper, confusion, maybe even fear. He glanced at his mother, who looked equally rattled, though she was trying to mask it with indignation. And there I was, standing in the middle of the room, every ounce of humiliation I had endured over the years boiling under the surface. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one shrinking away from their sneers and laughter. I was the one holding the cards. But I wasn't ready to show my full hand. Not yet. The silence stretched, waiting for me to speak. for me to confirm or deny what had just been revealed. I took a slow breath, meeting Muriel's piercing glare head-on. "Funny how things aren't always what they seem," I said. And just like that, the tension in the room coiled tighter, every guest leaning in, every relative bracing for what would come next. The tension in that room was like a rope pulled too tight, every strand straining, threatening to snap. I could see it in their faces, my aunt's forced composure, my uncle's barely concealed irritation, Ezra's smirk flickering in and out like a faulty light bulb. Even the guests, most of whom didn't know me beyond being the other cousin, were shifting uncomfortably, their curiosity pricked. Mr. Callahan cleared his throat, clearly sensing the unease but too professional to drop the subject. "I should say," he continued carefully, "the contribution wasn't small. In fact, it was substantial. Our school owes a great deal to Finn's generosity and initiative. Without his support, several of our advanced placement programs might not have survived this year." That was it, the confirmation that the whispers hadn't dared to guess. The silence that followed was thicker than before. People weren't just surprised now, they were recalibrating, rewriting the image of me they had carried in their heads. And that's exactly what Muriel couldn't allow. "Oh, stop," she said suddenly, her laugh too sharp, too rehearsed. "This is clearly some sort of mix-up. Finn must have been a middleman or something. There's no way he actually has the resources to do something like that." Her words were dismissive, but I noticed her hand tightening around the stem of her glass. Her knuckles had gone pale. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the silence sit. Let them stew in it. For years, I had been talked over, drowned out, made invisible by louder voices and sharper tongues. Tonight, I wanted them to feel what it was like to wait for me. Finally, I spoke, calm and deliberate. "It wasn't a mix-up," Robert scoffed, stepping in front of his wife like a guard dog. "So what? You expect us to believe you've been what? Secretly successful while the rest of us thought you were struggling to keep your head above water?" "Yes," I said plainly. A ripple went through the crowd. Some guests looked amused, some skeptical, others intrigued. Ezra, however, pushed off the wall, his eyes narrowing as though he'd finally realized he wasn't the center of the story anymore. "Come on," he said, his tone dripping with disbelief. "You can't expect anyone here to take you seriously. You? Running something big enough to fund schools? That's laughable." I tilted my head toward him, studying the desperation in his voice. He was nervous, though he masked it with bravado. For once, I didn't feel small under his gaze. "You'd be surprised what people can accomplish when no one's watching them," I said. That line landed harder than I expected. A few guests murmured in agreement, while others leaned closer as though they were waiting for me to reveal more. But Muriel wasn't finished. She moved closer, her voice sharp enough to slice through the room. "You're misleading everyone, Finn. I don't know what you're playing at, but this charade is going to end now. Ezra's the graduate. This night is about him, not you and your fantasies." She emphasized the last word with a bitter sneer, as if she could will the truth into bending. Mr. Callahan shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing he had walked into family politics he hadn't signed up for. But instead of backing down, he glanced back at me. "Well, the records speak for themselves. Finn, your company." "Company?" Robert cut in sharply. "What company?" The room stilled again. Every eye was on me. My parents weren't there. They had long since excused themselves from these family gatherings after years of tension, but my aunt, uncle, and cousin were enough of an audience. And all those neighbors and teachers and extended relatives standing around, they were the perfect stage. I could have ended it there. I could have corrected the record, downplayed things, let Ezra have his night back. But as I looked at Muriel's sneering face and Ezra's smug grin, the years of humiliation came back in waves. Every insult, every time, they made me feel like I was worth less than the dirt under Ezra's shoes. No, they didn't get to dismiss me anymore. I straightened, my voice carrying evenly across the room. "Yes, my company." The whispers rose again. Muriel's jaw tightened, her veneer cracking. "What company?" she repeated, her voice icy. I met her stare. "The one you laughed at years ago. The one you told me would collapse before it even began. The one you said I had no business running." Recognition flashed in her eyes. For just a moment, I saw the memory strike her. The night she had mocked me at dinner for even daring to call myself a business owner. She had looked me dead in the eye then and told me I was playing pretend. She blinked it away quickly, but it was too late. I saw it. That, she said, scoffing again, though her voice wavered at the edges. That little side project? Please, don't exaggerate. Ezra crossed his arms, glaring at me. You mean the one you kept quiet about because you were embarrassed? That wasn't a real company, Finn. Admit it. You're just trying to steal the spotlight. His words might have landed if they weren't so transparently defensive. Some guests even frowned at him, as though his attempt to deflect was more telling than he realized. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I let the tension sit again, simmering. The silence was no longer my enemy. It was my ally. Finally, I said softly, "You'll see soon enough." And just as I spoke, Mr. Callahan, perhaps without realizing the powder keg he was lighting, pulled a document from the folder. I probably shouldn't share too much, but it's not confidential information. Finn's company isn't small. It's listed as one of the largest contributors in the county. Frankly, I was shocked when I saw the figures. The room gasped. Muriel's face drained of color, though she quickly tried to cover it with indignation. Robert looked at me as though seeing me for the first time. Ezra's jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. And me? I stood there, silent, letting them absorb it. Letting them drown in the realization that the cousin they had ridiculed, the nephew they had belittled, the boy they had brushed aside, was the one they were now forced to acknowledge. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The guests were leaning in, some whispering, others waiting for the next word. The atmosphere had shifted completely. The party no longer belonged to Ezra, and that truth was eating him alive. Muriel finally snapped, her voice rising louder than before, cutting through the murmurs. Enough. This is ridiculous. You're all being fooled. There's no way he could have done any of this without trickery, or help, or something. He's nothing but a fraud. Her words echoed through the hall, harsh and bitter. The guests stilled again, waiting for me to respond. And as I opened my mouth, I knew this was only the beginning of what was about to unfold. I took a deep breath and let my gaze sweep across the room. Every relative, every neighbor, every teacher, and every guest could feel the tension coiling in the air like a storm about to break. Muriel's voice had shattered the fragile calm, but I wasn't going to let her set the pace. Tonight, I controlled the rhythm. You think I'm a fraud? I said slowly, my voice calm but deliberate. You think I couldn't have done this on my own? The room hushed immediately. Some people leaned forward, curious. Some looked around at each other, unsure how to interpret what they were witnessing. And all the while, Muriel's eyes blazed, caught somewhere between disbelief and fury. I let the silence stretch a beat longer than necessary, letting every word I hadn't said yet hang in the air, thick with tension. Let me make something very clear, I continued. I didn't hide my business because I was embarrassed. I hid it because I didn't want to hear the same thing I've heard my entire life. The endless comparisons, the jokes, the condescending advice from people who never thought I was capable of anything. A few heads nodded slightly. Mr. Callahan's expression remained measured, but there was a hint of approval there. He could see, as could the guests, that this wasn't about showing off. This was about finally setting the record straight. Ezra scoffed, trying to interrupt, but I raised a hand and didn't let him speak. You've spent years telling everyone that I'm insignificant, that I'm nothing compared to you, I said, letting the words hit like carefully aimed darts. You've mocked my work, minimized my accomplishments, and treated my successes like accidents. But I've been building something real, something sustainable, something that matters. And apparently, now you're just realizing that. Muriel's face had gone pale, though she still tried to maintain her air of control. Finn, don't, she began, but her voice faltered under the weight of the room's attention. I didn't stop. I walked closer to the center, letting the eyes of every guest track me as if I were stepping onto a stage. This folder, I said, holding it up, isn't just paper. It's proof of years of hard work that none of you bothered to notice. It's proof that I'm more than the mistakes you imagined, more than the comparisons you made to Ezra, more than the cheap dismissals you've leveled at me my entire life. There was a murmur in the crowd, curiosity, disbelief, maybe even admiration. I caught a few people whispering to each other about how they had always underestimated me, about how they had assumed I was nothing more than the forgotten cousin. Ezra's face had changed. The smug grin was gone. Now, it was tension and calculation, as though he were trying to figure out how to salvage the remnants of his dignity. Robert's jaw was tight, and Muriel's hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it behind her clutch of the champagne glass. "You want to know why I didn't tell anyone?" I asked, my voice lowering slightly, drawing people in. "Because I wanted to see how far I could get without their support. Because I wanted to prove to myself that I didn't need anyone's approval to succeed. And apparently, it's taken until now for the people who spent years underestimating me to realize. I don't need their approval at all." The room was completely silent. Even Ezra wasn't daring to speak, his usual barrage of sarcasm and mockery snuffed out by the weight of the moment. I paused, letting the silence sink in further. Then I looked directly at Muriel, my aunt who had spent years trying to make me feel small. "And you, Aunt Muriel, you might want to rethink the narrative you've been telling everyone about me. The one where I'm incapable, the one where I'm insignificant, the one where Ezra is the only one worth celebrating." Her mouth opened, but no words came. She had always been quick to dominate any conversation, quick to mock, quick to shape the story. But now, she had nothing. Nothing except shock and the faint glimmer of fear. I let my gaze sweep the room again, taking in every familiar face that had ever been part of the chorus of dismissal. And to those of you who laughed when I was overlooked, who whispered behind my back, who assumed I was less than, I'm not angry at you anymore. I'm simply letting the truth speak for itself. And that truth? It's far louder than your laughter ever was. The whispers began again, but this time they weren't directed at me. They were directed at my family. Neighbors were exchanging glances, teachers were nodding subtly, and even a few of Ezra's friends were wide-eyed. For once, the narrative wasn't under Muriel's control. It was under mine. Ezra's face twisted in frustration. You can't just, this isn't about you. This is my night." I let out a quiet laugh. Not mean, not loud, but low and steady. "Actually, it was your night," I said, "until you spent years telling everyone else that mine didn't matter." I let that hang. And now, the story's different. That's when Mr. Callahan, who had been standing patiently beside me, cleared his throat. "If I may," he said, holding up the folder again, "I think it's only fair that everyone sees exactly what Finn has done. I have the documents here, financial statements, contributions, authorizations. It's all verifiable. Every program, every student impacted, every school initiative. You can see it all." The room shifted uneasily. Muriel stepped back, and I noticed Robert glance around as if he was trying to find someone to validate his disbelief. Ezra's face was frozen, and for the first time, I think he genuinely realized he wasn't the one in control anymore. "I think it's time," I said softly, but firmly, "that everyone understands exactly who's been pulling strings behind the scenes, and who's been underestimated every single step of the way." I could see the panic growing in my aunt and uncle now. Their carefully curated image of dominance was crumbling right before them. The guests were leaning in, eyes wide, some whispering to each other about the irony, about the quiet cousin no one paid attention to now standing as the central figure. And just as I opened my mouth to begin revealing the first layer of the business deals, the first proofs of my success, the documents that would make them squirm, that would make the entire room realize just how blind they had been, the front door opened. All conversation stopped. All eyes turned. And there, standing in the threshold, was someone I hadn't expected, someone whose presence would change the trajectory of the night entirely. I didn't recognize the weight in their expression at first, but then I did. And I knew this was about to escalate in ways none of us could have anticipated. The person at the door was my business partner, Mara, someone who had been working with me from the very start and knew every detail of how far we had come. She carried a small stack of binders, each thick with documents, spreadsheets, contracts, and letters from schools and organizations I had supported. Her presence immediately shifted the room's energy. She didn't need to explain herself. Her authority spoke for itself. I gestured for her to come forward, and she stepped into the center of the room beside me, placing the binders on the table with a quiet but deliberate confidence. "These are the records," she said, her tone measured. "Every program funded, every student supported, every authorization signed by Finn. Everything is verifiable and transparent." Muriel's face went pale. Her lips pressed into a tight line, and Robert's hands fidgeted at his sides. Ezra's usual smug confidence was gone, replaced by tight-lipped anxiety. They had always relied on their ability to shape the narrative, to control perception, but now they had no control over the facts in front of everyone. I picked up the first binder, flipping to the first set of pages. "Let's start with the scholarship program," I said. Many of you laughed when I mentioned it. But thanks to these funds, 20 students in the district received full scholarships for advanced courses this year. Every student is listed with the school's confirmation and letters of thanks from teachers and principals. I let that settle in. Murmurs spread across the room, some impressed, some incredulous. I could see Muriel's panic growing with every word. She opened her mouth, tried to interject, but I raised a hand. "No interruptions. This isn't about opinions. These are facts." I moved through each binder systematically, funding for the science labs, art programs, library expansions, even technology grants for underfunded schools. Each time I mentioned a contribution, I turned to the room, letting the audience absorb the reality of it. People whispered to one another, shaking their heads in disbelief at the quiet cousin they had dismissed for years. When I finished, I set the last binder down with deliberate finality. "And now," I said, looking directly at Muriel and Ezra, "you can understand why I didn't need your approval or recognition. I was too busy doing real work, helping real people, achieving real results." Muriel's face was tight, her lips pressed in anger. This doesn't change anything. Ezra's graduation is still about him. You're trying to steal his moment." I smiled faintly, calm and precise. "Ezra, your moment isn't lost. It never existed the way you think it did. Your family chose to celebrate you while ignoring years of my efforts. Tonight, the truth is what everyone remembers." Robert tried to step in. "Finn, we raised you. We supported you in every way. This is a betrayal." I shook my head. "No. The betrayal was years of dismissal, ridicule, and favoritism. You refused to acknowledge my achievements or my independence. You ridiculed me, condescended to me, and erased my efforts. That was the betrayal." Ezra finally spoke, his voice tight with frustration and disbelief. "So what now? You just humiliate us in front of everyone." I gave him a cold, measured look. "Not humiliate. Reveal the truth." The room was silent. The energy shifted completely. Guests looked at Muriel and Robert with a new perspective, whispering about the audacity of their long-standing behavior. Even Ezra's friends were quiet, unsure how to react to the reality they had never seen. Muriel finally spoke again, but her voice lacked conviction. This isn't the end. People will forget, and this won't matter in a week." I shook my head slowly. "It matters because it's documented. It's verifiable. And it's in the hands of the people who can see the difference between someone who talks about achievements and someone who quietly makes them happen. You have no narrative left to control." By the end of the evening, it was clear who held the power. The crowd had shifted in its perception, and Muriel, Robert, and Ezra were left exposed for the villains they were. Their years of manipulation, favoritism, and condescension were laid bare, and there was no hiding behind wealth, charm, or social appearances anymore. I left the party knowing they would never look at me the same way again. They had underestimated me for years, and now everyone knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. The humiliation, the attempts to belittle me, the arrogance, they had all boomeranged right back onto them. I walked out into the cool night, feeling lighter than I had in years. The truth had been revealed, my efforts acknowledged, and the family's long-standing cruelty finally confronted. And as for them, Muriel and Robert would spend months scrambling to salvage their image. Ezra would struggle with the reality that he was no longer the favored, untouchable cousin, and the entire family dynamic had shifted irreversibly. For once, I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their validation. I had my success, my proof, and my revenge. The villains had been exposed, and I had the satisfaction of knowing that their arrogance and entitlement would never overshadow me again. And that night, for the first time, I felt truly free. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.